All right, this is part three, and we're thinking now about two other important classical theorists, Max Weber and Emile Durkheim. So I have here Max Weber. Weber writing a few generations after Marx. You remember Marx was born in 1818, Weber born in 1864. Weber is engaging with a lot of Marx's ideas and concepts. He's certainly not a Marxist. He's very critical of many of Marx's ideas, but he's also drawing inspiration from parts of them as well. And I think here, as I explain Weber, you'll see some similarities and some differences between the two thinkers. Weber also would not really be termed a sociologist proper. He did not like the term sociology because of what sociology meant during his time, and he was very critical of the approaches to sociology that were common in his day. He really hated the positivist notion of sociology, and he sought to create new kinds of sociology that he think better respected the fact that human beings could not be studied in the same way as phenomena in the natural world, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So really he's known mostly as a political economist, a legal scholar, a historian, and so on. Okay, unlike Marx, he was German. Some of Weber's key questions that he was trying to answer in his theories, the first one is probably this idea of authority. Weber, like Marx, is interested in social power and social domination, and he has an extraordinary deep interest in authority. Who has authority? Why do they have authority? How is authority maintained? How does authority change over time? That's very important for Weber. We then have this question of what is the role of ideas in social change? So Weber disagreed with Marx's idea that economics, the economic foundation of a society, is always the driver of change. Marx believed that if societies change, they change because fundamentally of something that's going on at the level of economics. Weber was somebody who disagreed with that. He thought that ideas, values, cultural ideas, religious ideas could equally have influence over the course of human society, and he worked to demonstrate that against the work of Marx. Weber, like Marx, was also interested in industrial capitalism and just in modern civilization in general. He wanted to understand what is different about modern society. Remember, these early theorists, they're looking out at their societies changing. There's industrialization, there's revolution, there's tumult, and they want to understand what's going on. How are the societies in which we live different from the societies that people lived in the past? Okay. And as I've said, the last question of Weber is this idea of how is social science different from physical science? He disagreed with the positivist view that you could study human beings just as you studied rocks, or just as you studied physical forces. He said, no, human beings are different. They demand a different kind of inquiry. We cannot just use the method of the natural sciences. And I'll try, as I go through my explanation of Weber, to touch back on some of these key questions and ideas. Let's think first about authority, power, hierarchy in society. One of the ways that Weber diverges from Marx is that while he acknowledges the importance of class as a principle for structuring societies, he doesn't believe that class is the only form of social hierarchy or even the most important form of social hierarchy. And what he does is he develops this threefold typology of different forms of social power, of which class is only one. So Weber wants to ask, what gives people power in societies? On the one hand, you might say class, that economic wealth, economic resources, money, capital, and so on, all that can give one power. But for Weber, that's not the only thing that can give you power. You can also gain power via status. And status can be linked to class, but for Weber, not always. There are cases where social status might not be linked to class. People might share a class, but have varying levels of social status within that class. So Weber thought there was a form of social power that could be based upon social honor, prestige, anything that made someone think someone was better than them, and therefore to follow them because they were better than them, or to do what that person tells them because they feel that they're better than them. Lastly, Weber also talked about party. Weber believed that power could also be developed and maintained by membership in political organizations. And sometimes members of different classes, for instance, could be part of the same political party. And we know that today, political parties might represent different economic interests, But people who vote for, say, the Liberal Party or the Labour Party don't always belong to the same class. And in Weber's view, the interests represented by those parties are often interests that might cross different classes in certain ways. Okay, so Weber develops a more multidimensional theory of social hierarchy. He fundamentally disagrees with the Marxist idea that everything comes down to class and that those who have the most power in society are always the ones with the most money. A good example of this is Weber himself was very interested in kind of ancient Vedic civilizations, Indian civilizations, and so on. And he would look at the caste system. And the caste system is interesting because the caste system, which is a very complicated phenomenon, it's hard to make generalizations about it, but the caste system was generally a hierarchy of status rather than a hierarchy of class. So certain people were at the top of the caste hierarchy. Typically this was the Brahmin caste was seen as the caste with the most social authority and prestige, but this caste did not always have all the economic resources. Sometimes there were lower castes that actually had more money, more resources than those who were in the higher Brahmin class. This was because the Brahmin caste was often the caste of priests, scholars, and so on, whereas some of the lower castes included rulers and warriors, merchants, and so on. So these people often had more abilities to amass economic wealth. And Weber's point is, even though they had more economic wealth, they didn't always have a monopoly on social power. The high caste groups, because they had more status and more prestige, could often tell the lower groups what to do, even though they didn't have full control of the economic resources of the society. If you want perhaps a more easy contemporary example, think of the phenomena of the cashed up bogan. This is a person who is gaining economic wealth, who is working a traditional kind of lower class occupation, but earning a lot of money from doing that, but who doesn't get any status from that. Yes, they're still seen as a bogan, and that's the status term. So even though they might be gaining more economic power, Weber thinks they still might follow the lead of those with more social power coming from their social status. Okay, so for Weber, remember, the key idea is that class and status don't always go together. That was one of the major disagreements that Weber had with Marx. Another one was on Marx's ideas about history. Remember, I said that Marx's idea is that history always follows the lead of economics. If social change happens, it's because it's demanded by the needs of the economic system, particularly by the needs of resolving conflict between classes. And Weber disagreed with that. He wrote a very influential text, probably one of the most famous texts of social science, called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And in this text, Weber wanted to examine how changing religious ideas in Europe actually helped to cause the emergence of industrial capitalism. So Marx's idea is that capitalism comes first, and then religious ideas change in order to justify the new system of exploitation. Whereas Weber's idea is that no, the religious change might have in fact happened first, which then paved the way for the emergence of capitalism. So you see the disagreement between the two. Weber's ideas in the Protestant ethic is he looked at how Protestantism as a form of religion differed from Catholicism. And he noticed how there were certain features of Protestantism which encouraged people to invest any extra money they had. So when the Protestant had extra money, when they made money from, say, business investments, the question was, what should they do with that money? Well, according to their religion, they couldn't spend it on themselves, because that would be a form of gluttony. You didn't want to have this ostentatious show of wealth, because that wouldn't seem very pious, right? And so you think, maybe they could give it away. Maybe they could be charitable. But under certain forms of Protestantism dominant in Europe at the time, that was seen as encouraging indolence. You didn't want to just give all your money away to people. It would encourage them to be lazy and so on. It was not really seen as the appropriate thing to do. So what do you do with this money? You can't spend it on yourself. You can't give it away to others. For Weber, you invest it. And so Protestantism kickstarts this immense wave of investment, the investment of capital across Europe. And for Weber, this paves the way for the emergence of industrial capitalism. Okay. One important thing about this story is that Weber doesn't believe that it's always the case that ideas determine the course of economic change. Marx believed that economics always determined everything else, but Weber had a more holistic understanding of how things were caused in the social world. He fundamentally disagreed that social change could be driven by one factor, that it's always class, it's always conflict, it's always economics, it's always religion. Weber believed in different circumstances, different kinds of causal factors could be relevant. And that's an idea which has become very important in contemporary social science. There are some other ideas of Weber's you might be interested in. Weber is also associated with the idea of rationalization. And so when Weber looks at the Protestant ethic, he sees really a new way of relating to the world. He thinks that Protestantism had encouraged people to relate to the world in a fundamentally different way, on the basis of rational calculation. And Weber thinks that historically, human beings used to relate to the world more on the basis of their emotions and more on the basis of tradition. So if we ask the question of why people behave the way they do, Weber says, well, in the older human societies, typically they would do things because they felt like it or because it was traditional to do so. So people would get married because their parents got married and their parents' parents before them, and that's just what people do. They get married, it's traditional, it's the right thing to do. Weber thinks that human culture over the past few hundred years has been undergoing this deep process of rationalization. And what rationalization is, it's when all those older forms of human motivation, that is motivation based upon tradition, on personal values, on emotions, all that gets superseded, and people start to act solely on the basis of making rational calculations about the world. So they'll say, I'm not doing this just because everyone else did it, or because people used to do it. I'm going to sit down and figure out whether this is right for me, or whether this is the most efficient and proper way to do something. And Weber saw this process of rationalization spreading throughout all different institutions in human society. Say, in the field of intimate relationships, rather than just getting married because their parents got married, everyone else got married, people might sit down and say, well, do we want to get married? Is it right for us? Maybe we could use that money for another purpose. Maybe we could use it for a house deposit or something like that. Okay. You might also see this in something like art and design. Okay, why do we design houses in certain way, buildings in certain ways? Rather than just doing it on an emotional basis because we find it beautiful or attractive. Rather than doing it on a traditional basis because that's the way we've always designed houses. We might sit down and think, what's the most efficient way to design this house? What's the way that it could be cheapest? What's the way that it could maximize its energy efficiency, for instance? So increasingly in different domains of human life, Weber thinks that we are making rational calculations about the world. And this form of rational behavior is starting to dominate human behavior as a motivation for action. One aspect of this, Weber thought, is the rationalization of authority. So remember, Weber is interested in what creates authority in society. Why do we listen to people in authority? And Weber thought there were these three different types of authority that could be referred to. The first one was charismatic authority. He thought maybe people could listen to other people because they found them charismatic, because they thought they were superhuman individuals, people with particular insights or power or abilities. Another reason why you might follow someone in authority is because of tradition. So you might follow someone because they've always had power. It seems like the right thing that they have power. Everyone else believes that their authority is traditional. So okay, we all listen to that person, or that group of people in a case. The third form of authority for Weber is this idea of rational legal authority. And this is, okay, why do we follow along with, say, an order or a command? Well, one reason under the rational legal form is because it's written down somewhere. There's a legal codification, there's a set of rules, there's a set of guidelines, and someone can point to that and say, this is exactly why you have to do it. And we generally agree this is the best way to do things, it's the most efficient way to do things. We think we can rationally justify those particular rules. Okay. And so Weber sees these different kinds of authority being dominant at different points in human history. If we think of, say, charismatic leaders, we can think of many religious leaders as being charismatic leaders. Why did the initial disciples follow someone like Jesus? Because of that personal charisma they felt in the individual. Traditional authorities, we might think of something like a monarchy, or even something, in the religious example, we could think of the papacy as a traditional form of authority. Why do people listen to the Pope? Well, the Pope has this, it's traditional to follow the Pope, if you are a Catholic in this case, okay? Rational legal authority for Weber is the authority that girds most modern organizations. Okay, so if you're in a workplace, or if you're looking at contemporary forms of governance, you're typically not saying, okay, I'm going to do what my boss says or what the workplace says because I'm influenced by the personal charisma of my boss. Usually there'll be some kind of contract, some kind of guidelines that specify what you have to do in the workplace. And the authority derives not from the personal charisma of the boss, not because of some traditional allegiance to the workplace, but because of these rational kind of legal forms of documentation, which then start to become dominant. For Weber, this is one of the key things, that rational legal authority is becoming dominant across a wide range of social institutions. And it's something you might see later in the course. This idea might come up in other theorists, this idea of the rationalization of society, and particularly the rationalization of authority. Okay, so that's a bit of a taste of some of the things that Weber is interested in. One thing I did want to say about Weber, which is interesting, is that Weber really disagrees with the structuralist stance of Marx. He doesn't like the idea that human beings are wholly determined by the forms of culture around them. He doesn't like the idea that history and culture obey certain universal fixed laws. Okay. What he believes instead is that sociological explanation must always consider the possibility of individuals to act in different ways, the agency of individuals, the free will of individuals. Marx thinks that history is about these universal laws that compel people to behave in a certain way. Weber sees individuals as the source of social change. Individuals consciously striving to change the world, to come into conflict with other groups, and so on. And so Weber has a very different idea of what sociology is. He doesn't think that sociology is about uncovering the laws that all human beings follow in their behavior. He thinks rather the goal is what he called Verstehen. Verstehen is a German word that means understanding. He thought the goal was to try and understand other people, to see their point of view, to see why they behave in certain ways. And he believed that we should focus as sociologists on the intentions, the thoughts, the motivations of other people, and to try and see things from their point of view. So he gives you a very different model of what sociology should be doing, one that's far more attuned to the inner life of the individual, rather than just looking at broader social structures and how they might influence the individual. So a couple of influential ideas that come from Weber and out of this discussion. Weber, interestingly, differs from figures like Marx in believing that sociology should tie itself to certain political aims and ambitions. Weber was a strong believer in value neutrality. He believed that we should try and reduce the influence of our personal biases when we do sociology. Okay, so Weber hated the idea that a teacher of sociology would preach certain political ideas or something like that. Okay, very different from Marx on that score. And some sociologists today have taken up this idea of value neutrality and continue to try and uphold it in their teaching and research. Weber also gives us this sense that we should avoid monocausal explanations. That is, explanations which only refer to one thing. Oh, it's always capitalism. It's always genetics. It's always religious ideas. Weber thinks, no, that's way too simplistic. We have to think about all the different things which can impact on human societies and their development, and we should try and develop much more holistic explanations of why certain things have happened. Weber didn't think you could explain capitalism by just pointing to religion or just pointing to conflict. He believed it was more complicated. I talked in the last slide about Weber's anti-positivist view. So Weber did not agree that we can use the tools of science, natural science, in sociology, because he believed that people did not follow laws in the same way that, say, a rock would. Human beings can be unpredictable. Human beings can learn your sociological generalizations and then change their behavior. If I develop theories about a rock, the rock doesn't change its behavior. But when I develop theories about human beings, they might say, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to change my behavior. Yes? It might alter the way they behave. They might have their own interpretations of why they behave in certain ways. Okay? So Weber thought that you could not study human beings in the same way you studied rocks, or the same way you studied physical forces or chemicals or anything like that. Human beings have more free will, they have more capacity to change, more capacity to be unpredictable. And that led him to develop a different idea about social science. And finally, I've talked about Weber's interest in authority. I've given you a taste of his idea that there are different forms of authority, and a lot of sociologists have taken on this idea that studying authority, studying power, is something we should be really interested in. Okay. Let's go straight into Durkheim, and I'll try and speak a bit more briefly about Durkheim here. Durkheim was born in 1858. he was a French sociologist, and he strongly identified as a sociologist. So unlike Marx, unlike Weber, Durkheim was a sociologist to his core, and he was heavily influenced by Comte, who I talked about in the first part. Durkheim was one of the key reasons that we have sociology today. He fought very hard to institutionalize sociology as a discipline. At the time, there was a bit of debate. This thing called sociology, is it legitimate? Is it possible? Can we have a thing called sociology? And Durkheim fought very hard to make sociology become seen as a legitimate scientific discipline. Okay, so we owe a lot to Durkheim, and he was in fact the first professor of sociology in France. What is Durkheim interested in? Well, while Weber and Marx are primarily interested in conflict, power, etc., Durkheim is more interested in the question of social integration. Okay? What makes a society hang together? What stops the society from falling to pieces, breaking apart? What keeps the individual committed to society? Okay, so Durkheim studies these mechanisms, and he studies how they've changed throughout history. And he wants to know what motivates the individual to be a part of society in the first place. Durkheim, like Marx, is also interested in this question of how is the individual shaped by society? How does being a member of a society change my mentality, my behavior, the way I think, the way I feel, the way I see the world? These were all Durkheim's key questions. So as I've said here, Durkheim was really interested in justifying the existence of sociology. He wanted to prove to people that sociology was important and necessary. And a lot of his works are designed to show that proof, if you will. Durkheim's fundamental thought is that if you want to explain human behavior, you cannot do that without referring to social forces. Just referring to biology, psychology, and so on were not enough. Even our most personal, intimate things, the things we wanted and desired, the kind of people we love, etc., for Durkheim, these were all influenced by social factors. The example I often give of this is take something like your voice, the human voice. If you're trying to understand me now, why do I speak the way that I do? To a certain extent, it's biological. I have an anatomy. I'm a male, there's a certain shape of my face, a certain length of the vocal cords. It gives me a certain way of speaking. There are psychological factors that change the way I speak. I could be more timid and shy. I could be a more confident person and have a louder voice. That changes the way I speak. But for Durkheim, you can't just stop there. What about the fact that I have an accent? Right? What about the actual language that I'm using? All these things situate me in a certain culture. And Durkheim, this was his fundamental idea. If you want to explain behavior, you can't leave the social part out, because the social part influences quite deeply the way that human beings behave, even something as simple as my voice. Okay. So Durkheim would often speak of these things he called social facts. And social facts essentially were social factors that could influence human behavior. Things in this social environment which would cause changes in human behavior. And one famous example from his work is population density. He thought that the density of our living spaces, how closely clustered people were together, could have an immense impact on their how societies were organized and operate, but then also how individuals would behave in those societies. Okay. Let me give you an example of how Durkheim tried to prove his case about the importance of sociology. And probably the most famous book here is Durkheim's book on suicide. Again, like Weber's text, The Protestant Ethic, one of the most important texts of early sociology. So Durkheim's argument was that even though suicide was a highly personal, individual act, seemingly something that only arises out of the psychological distress of the individual, Durkheim's argument was that, no, it's actually a social phenomena. It has to be a social phenomena because different countries have different suicide rates. So there must be something within the culture of these countries that is influencing people to commit suicide or to be more suicidal. One of Durkheim's examples was Durkheim looked at Protestant and Catholic countries. And in the data that he was looking at his time, he found that the suicide rate was higher in Protestant countries versus Catholic countries in Europe at the time. And Durkheim tried to understand why that was the case. And his belief was that Catholicism was a more communal religion. To participate in Catholicism, there was more communal requirements, there was more social integration provided by Catholicism as a religion, whereas in Protestantism, the individual was more alone before God. So the individual was essentially on their own in that sense. Okay. And so Durkheim's idea was that maybe in Catholic countries there were greater forces of social integration that promoted communal life, communal well-being, whereas in Protestant countries you didn't have that strong integration, and this might have led to more suicidality. Okay, and that's again a conclusion which has been heavily debated in the literature. Many people disagree with it, many people disagree with Durkheim's data, but it's a good example of how he tried to show the importance of looking at social factors, even for something that seems psychological like suicide. One key idea that came out of Durkheim's work on suicide is this concept of anomie. And anomie has become a really big, important concept in sociology. What is anomie? Well, anomie refers to a state in which the individual does not feel connected to society. The individual does not want to participate in society. They don't feel like their values are reflected in the society. And this creates tension between the individual and society. And in his study of suicide, Durkheim thought that Catholic countries provided for less anomie, whereas Protestant countries created more anomie. And this was the cause of what he called anomic suicide, that is, suicide that occurs when individuals feel disconnected from the society around them. Some interesting things about Durkheim is that Durkheim thought that anomie could result from both too much or too little social regulation. So if the society clamped down too hard on the individual, if you feel like you have no freedom in society, this can also create this antagonism between the individual and society. But if the society really leaves you alone, lets you do whatever you want, doesn't give you strong norms and morals to follow, then again, Durkheim felt that there could be this disconnect. And Durkheim felt this would be a very uncomfortable feeling for the individual. That it could lead to suicide, depression, violence, social conflict, all these kinds of things. Okay. When talking about anomie, Durkheim often linked it to rapid social change. And if individuals who grew up in one environment with one set of expectations, the society changes around them and they can no longer live the life they feel like was promised to them by the society. And so they start to become very antagonistic towards the society. I've got an example here. This kind of young man is an example of this Japanese phenomena of the hikikomori. And these are young Japanese men who've essentially disconnected from society. They live in typically a room in their parents' house, play video games, surf the internet all day, very little motivation to go out and get a job, form social connections. They've essentially broken all contact with the society, and they would exist in this perfect state of anomie. And Durkheim would try to understand, well, what's going on here? Why have these individuals lost that connection to society? Where did the society fail to integrate them, to make them committed to the society? And there's all kinds of interesting new phenomena today which you could analyze using these kind of concepts of anomie, including these kind of Japanese phenomena. You might think of this kind of incel movement amongst young men. So we have a growing amount of young men who are unable to find romantic relationships and who have an immense amount of hostility towards the world because of that. There's this feeling like they've been promised something by the society. That society has told them that they would have happy married family life, and now they can't get it. It breaks their commitment to society, and this can be the source of violence, terrorism in some cases, but also depression and suicide on the part of the individual. Okay. So as I've said here, Durkheim is deeply interested in the question of social integration. He wants to understand what are the mechanisms that hold societies together. What is it that keeps me committed to the society around me? And he wanted to know how those mechanisms had changed over time. Are those mechanisms the same today as they were in the 16th century, as they were in the 3rd century, and so on? The key concepts which Durkheim develops to analyze this come out of one of his early works called The Division of Labour in Society. And Durkheim was deeply interested in the division of labour. And what Durkheim does in this work is he distinguishes between two ways that societies can be integrated. What he calls mechanical solidarity on the one hand, and then organic solidarity on the other. So in terms of mechanical solidarity, this is a form of integration based upon similarity between people. So people can be integrated into a society because they feel that everybody else has the same values as them. They share something. Maybe they share a religion, a culture, a language, something which keeps them wanting to have social intercourse with one another. This sense of, again, deep-rooted commonality. Durkheim distinguishes this from what he calls organic solidarity. And this is a kind of solidarity that keeps people together because they are dependent on one another. Not just because they see things the same way, they want to interact with one another, but because they have to interact with one another in order to survive. And Durkheim's basic idea was that over time in societies, we used to have mostly mechanical solidarity. If you look at very early human societies, tribal societies, small-scale societies, Durkheim thinks it's all about mechanical solidarity. That is, individuals are linked together because they share something: language, culture, ethnicity, kinship, religion, something like that. But as societies become bigger, more complex, more people, as they grow over bigger territories, Durkheim thinks mechanical solidarity can no longer work as well. The further you are away from other people, the less you start to share with them. The more that, say, change happens and you start to be pulled apart from the society. And so Durkheim thought that as societies got bigger, more complex, there had to be a switch towards organic solidarity. And this is why, for Durkheim, the division of labor starts to arise in society. Everyone starts to take on different occupational roles. And one effect of that is that people become much more dependent on the society around them. A hunter-gatherer could leave their society and still live okay, because they knew how to hunt, they knew how to gather. If you think today of yourself, how well would you fare without the society around you? We are so specialized in our occupations and our behaviors that we basically have to live in society in order to survive. It would be very hard for any modern individual to just break away, go and live in a cabin in the woods or something like that, because most of us don't have the skills to do that. And Durkheim thinks this is organic solidarity. We remain committed to the society because we depend on the society. Again, Durkheim's basic idea is that the division of labor is an incredibly useful social innovation that actually emerges in human societies as a way to keep people linked together, to keep the society stable and whole. So although Durkheim did feel that organic solidarity has become predominant, he still believed that modern societies had to have some degree of mechanical solidarity. We couldn't just all go off and do our own occupations. In order for people to exist in a society, Durkheim thought they had to share something. And Durkheim thought we needed some commonalities in culture or in our values. And if we didn't have those, we would inevitably have large-scale pathology, conflict between individuals, enemy, egoism, just a pursuit of self-interest without caring about anybody else, all these kinds of things. Okay. And one of the things that Durkheim was really interested in is what are the kinds of commonalities which have emerged as the force of religious belief has declined. So we don't all today share common religion. We don't share common values in many ways. What keeps us together? Why are we still participating? Durkheim thinks organic solidarity can't be the only reason. There has to be something that we share as a group of people. And one thing he pointed to was this idea of individualism itself becoming a value that we can share. So he thought that religions were being replaced by this modern, what he called the cult of the individual, this idea of individual freedom, individual rights. Durkheim felt that, well, maybe everyone is actually committed to the same value, that value being that everybody is free to have their own values. Kind of amusing in a way. But this was one of Durkheim's key ideas. He wanted to understand, what do we share today as groups of people? And if we don't share anything, then why are we actually still connected with one another? And this is something that many theorists have been interested in as we move into a period of more intense polarization in society. So let me conclude with Durkheim here. What were the key things that Durkheim gave to sociology? I'd say the first thing is a very strong support for positivism. So we've seen that Marx is very strongly interested in positivism. Weber does not like positivism. Durkheim has very strong support for it. He wanted to legitimize sociology. And part of the way he did that was to say sociology is a science like any other. He liked Comte. He liked Spencer's idea that societies are like organisms. They need these internal mechanisms that keep them stable, just like organisms need organs to keep them alive. Okay, so he has a very strong positivist notion. Durkheim also gives us this sense that social order is a problem. He gives us this functionalist method. And Steve talked a bit about functionalism last week. The functionalist looks at society and tries to understand what are the mechanisms that keep society operating and hanging together. And Durkheim gives us a very strong interest in this sense of what is it that actually keeps society stable? Why don't we have constant conflict and war and constant issues? What actually keeps us together? Durkheim also gives us, like Marx, this very strong sense in the ability of social structures to shape individuals. Durkheim is a structuralist like Marx, and he believes that structure is the most important thing. Human behavior is strongly determined by the social structures around us. And this is important for Durkheim because, again, it justifies the existence of sociology as a discipline. Durkheim's fundamental belief is that we must have sociology because if we don't have sociology, we will never be able to explain human behavior. If all we have is biology, psychology, these other things, economics, whatever, it won't be enough. We have to look at people's social conditions if we want to understand why they behave the way they do. And really, you can think of the idea of the sociological imagination as an idea which Durkheim gives to sociology. Okay, this idea that if you want to understand problems of the individual, you don't just look at the individual, you don't just look at their mind, you look at the culture, you look at the society. That, for Durkheim, is where the real point of interest lies. And I think this is something which Durkheim has really given, not just to sociology, but to the general world of culture as well. Okay. All right, that concludes our analysis of Marx, Faber, and Durkheim. Come back and I'll give a brief conclusion about where these kinds of ideas are going today in future social theory.